Hello, ladies and gentlemen, gabestah here. This is the full guide for Raiden, the heroic-only final boss in Throne of Thunder. And if you just need the basics for a quick guide, click on the annotation on screen. So, before we begin, I should mention that this fight is really easy. I don't know what my accent did there, but yeah, this guy's pretty simple. You can see the number of attempts at the top. This was the first week that we've gotten to him, first night even, and so it took us 19 tries to get our first kill. So that should put in perspective compared to the 100 plus and 200 of Dark Animus and many attempts on a lot of other bosses. This guy's kind of a pushover. And that was sort of known, but I didn't realize he'd be quite this easy. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about the mechanics that you do have to pay attention to and how you handle the fight. So the first consideration for your raid composition is the tank class that you want to use assigned to a raiden. Now, the main ability that your tank needs to worry about is Fatal Strike. This is used every 10 seconds throughout the first phase on the tank, and essentially it does very low damage in its own right, but it requires that the tank have their active mitigation ability going when the Fatal Strike hits, whatever that is for their class. So this would be like Shield Block for Warriors, Shield of the Righteous, Paladins, Shuffle for Monks, Blood Shield for Death Knights, and Savage Defense for Druids. If the tank does not have that active mitigation ability active and Fatal Strike hits them, they'll be killed instantly. So, for this reason, Monk tanks are especially good on this fight because they can very easily have 100% uptime on their shuffle, their active mitigation ability. It just comes with the territory, and therefore they don't really have to think about it. Whereas other tanks, I don't know all of them in detail these days, but I believe most other tanks would actually have to watch that and manage it. So that's the first consideration. Otherwise, just use your strongest tank, smartest player that can watch that Fatal Strike cooldown and make sure their ability is active when it goes off. The other thing to consider is how many total tanks you want to use. Now, there's no benefit to having multiple tanks on Raiden himself throughout the fight. There's no reason to do so. But if you want, you can use a second tank to handle the Crackling Stalker adds that will appear throughout the first phase. Now, I don't recommend using two tanks because we found it was just not necessary. And your main tank that's on Raiden can tank the adds. But that said, the adds do a fair amount of damage to the raid. So if you can't kill them very quickly or you don't have a lot of stuns available to them, then it may be somewhat dangerous. So if you use a second tank, your other tank just holds the Crackling Stalker at least 30 yards away from the raid so that the chain attack that it uses doesn't hit anyone else. That's the basic idea. But again, I would not recommend it. If you do one tank, then you can get an extra DPS or extra healer somewhere, and that'll help you a lot. So the other option, of course, is how many healers. In this video, we're using 2 healers, and it seemed to work pretty well. Again, very few attempts to actually get this guy down. So you can sort of decide whether you have strong enough healing to do 2 or you need 3. The DPS requirements are not very severe on this fight. The first phase sort of has a soft enrage that's about 5 minutes, a little over, which means that to get him to 40% in the first phase, you need only about 950,000 raid DPS, so very low value. But the second half of the fight, second phase, if you had that form of DPS, you would spend way too long in the second part of the fight and probably die just from damage. So yeah, just kind of figure out what your raid DPS is, whether you can afford 3 healers or not. It depends a lot how much range DPS you have as well. If you have a lot of range DPS, you can easily get away with 3 healers because range DPS are preferable to killing the orb spawns, since a melee have to run in and out to get to them. Okay, so that's the raid composition stuff. Let's move on. So the main mechanic on this encounter is the duality between Anima and Vita. And these essentially act as stances for raiden. So throughout the encounter, depending on how you handle the orbs that spawn, this will determine which stance raiden is active in at any given moment. And this further indicates which abilities you'll have to deal with throughout the fight. So, at any given moment, except for the very first few seconds of the fight, raiden will be in one of these stances, sort of. Now, the very, very common method, and Blizzard's even talked about how this was not really the intended way to do it, is to essentially have raiden in the Vita phase at all times, pretty much. You effectively ignore or negate the other half of the fight, which is the Anima mechanics. So, while it's maybe possible to do the fight in a different manner, there's pretty much no reason to do so. And doing so would be much more difficult than the strategy that you'll see here, which is the common way everyone does it this way. So, for that reason, I'm not really going to talk about some of the abilities that are only in the Anima phase, because they'll never be relevant, you'll never see them, and if you do, it's because you screwed up something else. So, what that effectively means is that a little bit of under half of the fight is completely irrelevant. Yay for design. Okay, so let's just talk about the various abilities that you will deal with and how they're activated and what you do to deal with them. So, you can change the stance or imbue that raiden has currently active between Anima or Vita by allowing him to absorb one of the orbs appropriate to the one you want him to change to. So, there's two ways to do this. The first way is to kill one of the orbs. If you kill an orb before it reaches him, this will cause him to instantly absorb the other orb, and if he is not currently in that stance type of the one that was absorbed, he will change to that stance immediately and use an ability. So, for example here, if we kill the Anima like we just did there, if he was not currently in the Vita stance, he would swap to Vita and use an ability doing so. And this would trigger all his normal Vita stance abilities throughout the fight. Similarly, if you don't kill any of the orbs and you just allow them to reach him, he will absorb them in that same fashion. So, you'll see at some point, we purposely choose not to kill one of the orb sets and instead allow him to absorb both orbs. This has the effect of swapping him between both stances almost immediately. So he'll go from his current stance into a different one and back to the original. And the use of both of these techniques is really the first key to this encounter. So because you will spend the majority of the fight with the Vita stance active, we'll talk about those main abilities. So the first Vita stance ability is Crackling Stalker. And I mentioned this ad briefly in the raid composition section. This will spawn one at a time in a random location around the room and engage your raid like normal. It does minor melee damage. However, the dangerous aspect is that it will use a chain lightning attack that will hit players within 30 yards, and it sort of increases in damage as it jumps. However, it is susceptible to stun effects, and because I strongly recommend a one-tank method, if you do use a one-tank setup, then you'll want to make sure the ad gets into melee range of your tank, and at that time you can use stuns and just try to chain stuns on it in a rotation. Otherwise, your DPS should focus on killing the Crackling Stalker right away, unless there is an orb that's active that needs to be killed. So orb will take top priority, but otherwise focus on the Stalker before your DPS get back onto the boss. And that's pretty much it. The Stalker will do a AE within 8 yards when it dies. That's pretty heavy damage. So again, it's important that you wait until it's in the tank position that's not on top of your raid before you actually kill it, so that that AE only hits the tank potentially. So the second major ability, the most important throughout the entire fight really, is Unstable Vita. And the way this works is as soon as you activate a Vita phase, so Vita stands for Raiden, he will cast Unstable Vita on a random ranged raid member. That player will then have a 12-second Vita debuff, at which point when Unstable Vita expires, it will cause a chain effect to trigger between that player and the furthest player target that it can find. So essentially the player that's standing the farthest away will be the new target of Unstable Vita. However, it will also hit anyone between the current player that has Unstable Vita and the furthest target. So it's important to have a clear line of sight between the old target and the new. Once Unstable Vita jumps from you, you will then become sensitive to Vita. And this is a debuff that lasts the remainder of the stance, basically until you change the stance on Raiden back to Anima once more. And while you're sensitive to Vita, if you get hit by Unstable Vita again, you'll be killed instantly. So what this essentially means is that once you start the Vita stance, every 12 seconds, a new player in the raid needs to get a stack of Unstable Vita and transfer it from the existing player. And this keeps traveling from one player to the next until all your players, or nearly all your raid, have the sensitivity debuff, at which point you need to reset the stacks and start over. So we'll get into the resets in a moment. But for now, the first thing to consider is how you position and handle the transfer of Unstable Vita to another valid target. So here on the screen you can see the top-down view of the arena with the circular raid markers that are in the video, which show the method that we came up with that worked really well for this. And there's sort of a common strategy where everyone stacks behind the boss, and then you have your players that are transferring Vita move back right or back left, but this is out of melee range, and so it means that any melee DPS in the rotation are out of melee range for 24 seconds essentially when they have to deal with it, or almost that much. Whereas in this case, with this setup, while they have Unstable Vita, they can stay within melee range and, be good to go. So you can see the markers are labeled there, but this is the basic setup. The boss is in the center of that triangle formation in the middle, with our tank at green, our raid stacked at blue, opposite the tank sort of. And then the purple marker to the north is where the player with Unstable Vita will stand. So they're within melee range, but they have a clear line of sight with no one else between them and the yellow marker, which is all the way to the north. The scale is not exact in this image, but basically you just have to ensure that the distance between the purple and the yellow is further than the distance between purple and anybody else. And if that's the case, then the player that's next in line to get Unstable Vita simply stands on yellow. When the 12 seconds expire on the purple target player, it will transfer to the new player on yellow, and then the yellow player just steps forward to the purple marker, and they wait their 12 seconds. And then once they wait their 12 and it expires, the new player that's next to get Vita is already on yellow, and it transfers to them, and so on and so forth. So as we loop back through, we can just see here, without the annoying overlay, the actual rotation in the raid itself. So here comes the first materials, and we're going to kill the Anima Orb, which will trigger the Vita phase instantly. And as soon as that goes off, we've got Unstable Vita, which is cast randomly, so it's on our Holy Paladin. So he stands on purple, and I'm the next player in our rotation, since we're just going alphabetical. And I go to yellow, and then once he passes it to me, now I go to purple, and there's our Elemental Shaman going to yellow. So I pass it to him, and now I can safely stack on blue because I passed it and I have sensitivity. Then our Shaman moves forward to purple, and he's going to pass it to our Moonkin Druid there at yellow, and she's got it. Now she moves forward and so on and so forth. So that's the process really. Once you get it down, it's pretty simple. And we actually tried using a common add-on, which is a Bigwigs plugin called Bigwigs Raiden Assist, but that was more harm than good. And it kind of has some weird ways that it does timing and tells you when to move and whatnot. Plus, it requires that you use the two spot method that are both out of range, basically. And that's not very good if you have a lot of melee DPS, which in this raid we have 4 of, so we wanted a way that allowed our melee to actually engage most of the time while they're dealing with unstable Vita. So when you transfer Raiden from a current stance to a different stance, from Anima to Vita or Vita to Anima respectively, he will activate his stance opener ability. And in the case of Vita, this ability is Unleashed Vita, which does 600,000 damage to the entire raid instantly. So it's pretty dangerous and needs to be cooldowned in some way. And similarly, if you trigger his Anima stance, he will activate Unleashed Anima, which applies a debuff to the entire raid that does 70,000 damage per second, but it increases your maximum health by 100%. So just keep both those in mind, that whenever you swap stances, which you'll have to do at some point, you're going to trigger those abilities. So you've got your rotation going for Unstable Vita, everything is going great, but eventually you're going to run out of valid targets to pass the Unstable Vita to, because everyone will pretty much already have the Vita sensitivity debuff. When this occurs, you need to force the sensitivity stacks to reset on the raid. And you do this by changing Raiden's stance to the Anima stance temporarily. Now, as mentioned before, you don't want to spend any time in the Anima stance because there's just a lot of craziness going on in there. That's not a good idea to deal with. So instead, you temporarily switch into Anima and then immediately switch back to Vita. So here you can see an example. This is the 7th set of orbs. So our tank moves the boss slightly toward the Anima orb so that the Anima is absorbed first. It's going to reach the boss first. As soon as it's absorbed, we all gain the Unleashed Anima and enter that stance, which immediately removes our sensitivity debuffs. But then just a moment later, the boss absorbs the orb for Vita as well, and we go back into the Vita stance. And now with our sensitivity gone, we get a new unstable Vita out, and the process repeats. We go back through the rotation just like we did before. So that's the basic rotation and idea around the entire first phase. You spend as much time as possible in the Vita stance, dealing with unstable Vita, until you can't deal with it anymore. Then you reset by forcing the boss to soak up Anima slightly before Vita. He resets, you go back into Vita, and you do it all again. And you'll keep doing this until you reach 40%. Now, every time you change Raiden's stance throughout the fight, he'll gain a stacking buff that increases his damage by 10% for the remainder of the encounter. And this also applies to the adds that he spawns, such as the Stalker. So, it's in your best interest to limit the number of stance swaps as much as possible by delaying as long as you can. Now, for the timing and 10-man from Unstable Vita's jumps, this means that you have to follow the rotation seen on your screen. So, the first orb that spawns, you will kill the Anima orb. This will cause Raiden to enter the Vita stance because he's not in a stance at the time, at the beginning. So you'll get the 600,000 AE on the raid. So you need to use a raid cooldown or 2. In our case, we used an Aura Mastery from a Paladin, plus everyone used a personal cooldown. And that was plenty of reduction. For the second and third orb spawns, once again, you kill the Anima orb, but there's no damage to the raid because he's not changing stances. He simply absorbs the existing Vita orb and causes no difference. However, after that, you're going to be up to the 9th person that has the unstable Vita or sensitivity. So you can't really afford to wait another round. So on the 4th round of orbs, you don't kill any of them, and you move the boss slightly toward Anima, so that the boss absorbs Anima first, then the Vita second, and resets everyone's sensitivities. This will also cause the boss to go into the Vita stance once more, since he went into Anima prior. So you'll get the AE on the raid, so once again use your raid cooldowns. And then the process repeats. Since that 4th one causes a new unstable Vita to go out, the 5th and 6th are just like before. You kill Anima on those. And then the 7th, you're at your max once again, so you reset, use raid cooldowns. And then 8th, 9th is still in Vita, so you kill Anima with no damage. And then for the 10th spawn, the boss should be hitting 40% before this point. If not, you're going to have a lot of trouble because the stat count, the percentage damage increase, goes up 2 every time he swaps between Anima and Vita, every time you reset. So after this 7th orb spawn is used to reset him, he's going to be at 5 stacks or 50% damage extra. So you don't want to do the 10th set because that'll be up to 70%, and that's going to make the last phase very difficult to heal. All right, so once you reach 40%, Raiden will enter phase 2, and the mechanics of the fight change dramatically here. The most important thing is that you're no longer dealing with the Vita mechanics as you were before. So no longer unstable Vita chains or anything like that. Therefore, your raid should instantly stack up behind the boss and stay there throughout the remainder of the fight, pretty much. And this will help your efficiency in heals and cooldowns and all that. The other thing is that the tank no longer has to deal with Fatal Strike in Phase 2, so that should please your tank. And then the orbs that spawn will spawn one at a time from random locations, but these are corrupted versions, and these have different effects than the versions that you saw in Phase 1. So the corrupted Anima, the red orbs, if they are killed, they will cause an AE of about 1 million damage split among all players that are within 8 yards of the orb when it dies. So basically everyone within melee range splits 1 million damage when it dies. Because of this, if you kill corrupted Anima orbs on this phase, you're going to want to have a rotation or of at least 1 or 2 players that can soak these with strong cooldowns. So a 90% cooldown reduction or something like that would be ideal. And that player could run out, stand under it in melee range when it's about to die, and have your ranged finish it off when it gets low. Now, to be honest, we didn't really consider that very well because we'd only seen this phase a couple times, and it didn't make much difference. So that would be the way to actually do it if you're planning ahead, which hopefully you are because you're watching this. Anyway. That said, if you choose not to kill a corrupted Anima and it is absorbed by Raiden on this phase, it will increase the total health of Raiden by 10%, and this will stack. So the best way to think about what that actually means in terms of his healing is that he effectively gains 10% of his current percentage of health. So if he's at 30% health and he absorbs a corrupted Anima in this phase, he will gain essentially 3% of his health, or heal that back. Now that sounds like a lot, maybe, but the reality is, looking at the logs, it's not that much. So we actually killed all the corrupted Anima in the second phase because we didn't know any better. We thought that was the best way to do it. But for our raid, for example, we did about 2 million DPS at the end here to the boss with Bloodlust up and all that stuff. So pretty decent. But with that DPS, the amount of damage that we would lose by swapping to kill an Anima, which takes about 12 to 13 seconds, so 12 and a half seconds on average, is much more than the actual heal that he could gain at this point from absorbing it. And even if we assumed that it was only 50% of our damage that was lost, so basically if we did 1 million lower DPS to the boss for every second that we were not attacking him, but instead attacking an Anima, that would still be about 2.5% of his health in lost damage. So the first orb that can possibly appear is only going to reach the boss in this phase around 30% health. I think it was at 29% when it reached the boss for us. So that means that even if the very first orb is a corrupted Anima and you let it heal, it's only a 3% heal on the boss. So any orbs that spawn after that are going to be even less of a heal. Probably 2.5%, 2%, 1.5%, and so on. So, in my opinion, having looked at this fight, done it in hindsight, I would recommend, especially if you have one tank and or two healers, to just ignore the Anima orbs on this phase and just DPS through that extra little bit of healing, because being able to just focus on the boss is a lot of DPS that you would otherwise lose from swapping. The other orb, the corrupted Vita, when you kill one of these, it will use a chain lightning attack on a random player, and it just chains throughout the raid. So effectively, this is really bad to do because killing it means that it's going to chain through the raid, and unless you're spread out. And if you spread out on this fight, you're going to have a bad time because healing is really difficult in this phase. So for that reason, you always ignore the corrupted Vita spawns and let them get absorbed. When a Vita absorbs, it increases the damage that Raiden does for the remainder of the fight by 10%, and this stacks. So it actually adds on to the existing stacks that he had from the other buff from the previous phase. So you should go into this second phase with 5 of those previous stacks for a 50% damage boost, and then every Vita orb that is absorbed in the second phase will add another 10% onto that. So I think at the end here, we get up to 8 stacks total, 5 of the first and 3 of the second. Yeah, looks like that. So that's a lot of extra damage that you're taking from the AE, from Ruin and stuff. So because the corrupted orbs that spawn in this last phase are random, you can get all Anima or all Vita or a proper mix of the two. So that will slightly change your luck just depending on how that goes. But otherwise, that's the second phase. It's just a matter of healing through that and using your raid cooldowns when appropriate. So the DPS requirement, again, is not that severe. You're going to burn through 35% of his health pretty quickly because he technically stops or dies at 5%. So focus all your DPS cooldowns for this phase, save them up, and then make sure you have your raid cooldowns ready. So we essentially ensured that all our raid cooldowns were available for this final phase and did our best to chain them when things got dicey. And as I mentioned, we did not understand or handle the corrupted Anima killings very well. So there you saw 2 of our melee die. That didn't help at all. But we recovered and finished it off. So yeah, just focus on healing. AE healing is the key, and then cooldowns. So I think that covers everything for Raiden. And of course, this brings Throne of Thunder to a close. It's been a fun little zone, or not even little, fun big zone. I've enjoyed it quite a bit, and I'm looking forward to see what Siege has in store for us. So, as usual, if you enjoyed, please subscribe, and as always, good luck, and thanks for watching.
5.
Yeah!
Wow.
We fucking got it.
Wow. I didn't think we were that close.
I got loot. What did I get?
Master Crafter!
I got a ring.
Oh,
Wait.
man!
How did we just get Master Crafter?
I don't know, but
That's
it's
pretty
I'm
awesome.
gonna take it.
Oh, I bet you using tokens counts as craft.
Ooh,
Did somebody win something?
treated.
I won a ring.
Wait a
Yep,
minute,
there
this
we
guy
go.
dies at 5%?
Yep.
That's awesome.